All right. Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming. We at the Eureka Public Library were wanting to do a few more local history programs because there's always a good response to that, and it's just always so interesting. So I talked to Jan Holliger about doing one on the history of Olio Cemetery. And she was willing to help me out with any of the research and everything. She had done quite a bit of research, and obviously this goes back generations in her family, the care of the cemetery. So she knows a lot about it. She's not able to be here with us today, but I based my presentation off all of her research, and then I can always ask her questions if you guys have something I can't answer. We can definitely get a hold of her. So the Olio Township Cemetery, we're going to kind of really start back at the beginning when the area was first settled. And Walnut Creek, the first settlements along Walnut Creek started taking place about 1823. They were scattered a little bit up and down the creek as it went, but it was, this shot here of Walnut Creek, or more modern day Walnut Creek, though it does kind of give you a good picture of what it must have looked like at that time. There would have been a lot of woods and trees, a lot of wildlife right around the creek, and then it would kind of open up into prairie a little bit on either side of it. Joseph Dillon was the first known English settler. He settled about 2.5 miles southwest of Eureka, from what we know. And then, a dozen more or so kind of trickled in between 1824 and 1830. It wasn't until 1832 that the land was opened for purchase. So they weren't purchasing land at this point, but they were just kind of going ahead and settling on it. And then 1832 was when you could officially start buying ground and stuff. And the Walnut Grove settlement in general was never a town per se or anything. It was just kind of a loose band of settlers up and down the creek, all the way from Mount Zion down to Mackinac. And it's kind of what they consider Walnut Creek settlement. So our story starts actually in 1832 with the Walnut Grove Church of Christ. Between 1830 and 1835, there were a large number of settlers who came from Kentucky, Virginia, Ohio. And a lot of them were followers of Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone. And they both had churches, Disciples of Christ and the Christian Church. They were kind of wanting to leave the larger Protestant movement to kind of get back to a New Testament version of the church. And so they kind of banded together, or they kind of unified both of their movements together into one. And in April of 1832, the Walnut Grove Church of Christ was formed in Walnut Grove, and the home of John Oatman, who lived, we believe, northeast of where Maple Lawn is currently. So he lived on that northern portion of Walnut Creek. Early settlers and church members for the Walnut Grove area were the Meek, DeWeese, Davidson, Myers, Radford, Bullock, Davenport, Major, and Dickinson families. So some of those names, of course, we know are still here with us today, and there are a lot of those names in the cemetery as well. This early church from 1832 up until the 1840s met in cabins, barns, houses, and outdoors. They really, they didn't have a meeting house. They just kind of traveled around, and it was infrequent too. It was weather permitting, what the road conditions were, and it definitely wasn't like every week, every Sunday, or twice a week, because it was just too hard to get together at that point. So one of those major early families was the Major family. Ben Major was born on October 31st of 1796 in Franklin County, Kentucky. And he purchased about 800 acres on the eastern edge of Walnut Grove in 1833. So he came up from Kentucky right about when the settlement came open for purchase. When he was in Kentucky, he was a slaveholder, but he became a follower of the Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ movement, and began to believe that slavery was not a Christian thing to follow. So he was in the process of educating his slaves because he wanted to free them, but he wanted to give them a good start though first. So he spent time and resources educating his slaves. He moved to Walnut Grove in October of 1834 with his wife, Lucy Davenport, and 5 children. And he became an elder of the Walnut Grove Church in 1836. His sister Eliza married his brother-in-law, the Reverend William Davenport. So Lucy Davenport's brother was William Davenport, and and Benjamin's sister Eliza also married into the Davenport family, and so kind of was a little bit of a group movement too. They knew people that were already up here, and so they came to this area, kind of following families. So they moved also about 1835. Benjamin left his slaves in Kentucky for a little while, but then he was in 1835, and he was able to free them, and he was a part of the American Colonization Society, which believed in giving their slaves the best start, and at that time they felt that was going back to Africa and having a colony there. So his slaves were settled back into Liberia in 1835. And there is a book, and I forgot to pull it out this morning, but there is a book all about that. They researched the major family as well as the colony that they settled in Liberia. And there are still people in Africa with the last name of Major right now in that area that can trace their roots back to this initial family of slaves that Benjamin Major sponsored to go to this colony. So I can pull that book if you're interested. It is really interesting. Benjamin Major was also a farmer, he was a businessman, and he also became kind of the community doctor as well. He didn't really have any official formal training, but he kind of studied along with some other people, and that was, the person you called was whoever in the community had the most medical knowledge. So he was kind of the on-call doctor for that area at that time. The book was called Liberty Brought Us Here. So we do have that in our collection. Some of his brothers also, William and Chestine, also gave up their slaves and moved here, but he did have one brother that stayed in Kentucky though, so. This is from the 1865 plat map of Olio Township. It is the earliest plat map that I am aware of, and so it's a little post-dates this period that we're talking about right now, but it does kind of give you an idea of where the major family's land was. If you can see where the Conover name kind of slants up, that is present-day Reagan Drive on out. And so the major family, if you drive out Reagan Drive now, you can't really see the houses, that they're back further, but the major family houses are still along that road. And so right this corner here was then part of their family, and this their ground, and then the north western corner, Rachel, sorry, is part of where the cemetery would be today. And so that was all just part of that major family farm at the time. In 1846, Ben Major offered to have the Walnut Grove Church of Christ build on the western part of his farm. The one-story frame building was built by carpenter Jonathan Tressler, and it was described as being about 30 by 50 feet with a 12-foot ceiling, and it faced west towards Main Street. There were two entry doors and windows on the side, and this is an artist's rendition of what that building looked like. So that was actually about on the site of where the present-day Civil War Soldiers Monument is, on the northern edge of the cemetery, right along Reagan Road, or Reagan Drive. And so I'll have another map to show of that. So here is kind of a map showing kind of the northern portion of the cemetery. So it gives you kind of an approximate location of where the church would have stood. And then in 1848, Ben Major built a one-room school just to the northeast of the church. So we kind of approximate, where, and again, that was almost like exactly right on Reagan Drive. And there is a marker stone along that road right now on Reagan Drive that marks that the school was built there in 1848. And so I have a picture of that down at the bottom. So you can see that if you're driving down Reagan Drive. So the school was run by Asa S. Fisher. It was replaced in 1849 with the 2-story brick Walnut Grove Academy, which was built about a block north on present-day Benham Street on the side of the Rinker home. So this school was only there for about a year, but again, it just kind of shows some of that early activity around this portion that later became the cemetery. And an artist rendition of that first schoolhouse in Walnut Grove there in the bottom as well. So 1846, the church was built, 48, there was a school built, and then about 1849 is when we think the burial ground was established. And it was established just to the south of the church building. It extended approximately 200 feet. The first known burial was Abraham Tressler, and he was a brother of the man who built the church, Jonathan Tressler. Abraham died on November 26, 1849 at the age of 22 from influenza. His brother died just a few years later in 1853. His stone is no longer there though, unfortunately. The stones, so this is kind of what the earlier style of gravestones during this period in the 1840s, 1850s. They're very kind of thinner rectangular stones, can be very carved with a lot of symbolic images. This one has a broken column, and broken column often is seen in gravestone symbolism as being a life cut short, or passing too young, life cut short. So, and it says my brother at the top of it. So we know, his brother Jonathan was the one that then purchased and had carved, or had the stone carved for them. So there are no known records of burials during this early period. So pretty much what they have to go on is just what gravestones are out there. The church did not keep a record from what we can tell. Families commonly buried their dead on their own private property during this period. However, it's understood that anyone could have buried their dead in the burial ground for free during this period, especially church members. So if they didn't have a farm, they didn't have their own private burial ground, they might have used the church burial ground then at that time. In 1852, a few years later, an unfortunate episode of cholera struck the Davenport and the Major families, and these are some of the next older gravestones that we have out there. In May of 1852, Reverend William Davenport unknowingly came in contact with cholera in St. Louis, and cholera had kind of like a 2 to 3 day period before he started showing symptoms. So he was home by the time he started showing symptoms. He recovered, but his wife, unfortunately, Liza, became sick. Ben, as the local doctor, immediately ran to his sister's side and attended to her and stayed with her until she passed. Ben and his nephew Joseph, Joseph Davenport, returned back to the Major home, but then they became sick. And Ben passed away, and then Joseph passed a few hours later, and then Joseph had a brother John who also passed the next day. So it was been a very short time. They lost about 4 members of their family. So the Davenport graves are out there. Ben Major's grave is there at the top. He was only 55 years old at the time. And then 2 of his nephews, John J. and Joseph. We don't know the location of Elias's grave and gravestone. It's thought that the Davenport family was initially buried on their own on their farm, and then maybe they were either moved here later or they had stones erected at a later date. So we're not exactly sure on that one, but the epidemics were a huge part of that pioneer lifetime. You just never knew what was going to come up or how to, they didn't understand its transmission and how it spread and what to do. So the little sign on the side is from a little bit earlier, 1830s, but it was from another epidemic in Illinois So warning people that, okay, if sickness is out there, here's what you need to do, or what they thought they needed to do at that time.
Love that. Do not sit or sleep in the draft.
Or air.
And don't get wet.
Yeah, don't get wet, I mean, abstain from cold water,
Ardent
yeah.
spirits. Ardent spirits.
Isn't that something?
And it had rendered them indispensable, take much less than usual. So I guess if you have to drink, don't drink too much.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, there was no,
Yeah.
cholera was such a severe savage disease, there was no preventing once it got a hold of your family. The next period, 1846 to 1864, there are about 34 existing headstones in the cemetery now with death dates from the 1840s to 1850s. Most of those are located in the oldest section, which is AB. That was the first section to be buried. That was part of the original church burial ground. And then AC next to it was the next portion, which would have been kind of in front of the church to be used for burials. Section AA in the upper right-hand corner, that is still owned by the Major family. They actually retained ownership of that land, so they still own that little portion where their family burials are. After Ben Major's death in 1852, his son Chastain inherited part of the family land. At some point, Chastain, who dies after the Civil War in 1865, Chastain and or the church opened AC and then AD for burials. There isn't a direct documentation on that, but at some point after that is when those areas started being built out. Some of the 1840s and 50s death dates are reinterments that are done at a later date. A clue to this can be the style of the gravestone. And it's also possible that the family replaced the stones at a later date. So it could be that there was an original stone, but later on they decided to buy new memorials for, their family members. And there's another possibility where there may not actually be burials where there are stones. And unfortunately, it's kind of a confusing mess. And we talk about this a little bit later, but record keeping was not very good at all during this period. So here's some more examples of stones from the 1850s, just some of the style of what this older type of stone looks like. On the left is Lavette Bradford. She died in 1854, only 3 years old. She has a very common symbols for mourning during this period, which is the weeping willow tree. So you'll see a lot of weeping willow trees. Those are some of my favorites in terms of just symbolism. And also a lamb, if you see lambs on there. Also that often indicates a very young child. And then Margaret and Robert Weiscarver, they died both at a very young age, 15 months and 19 months. And your heart goes out to that family to have to lose two toddlers, just a couple of years apart. They're in section AB. Elizabeth Creighton on the right, she was 35, but again, very similar carvings in terms of the Weiscarver stones. No symbolism, just, kind of just the basic information. What their age was, 49, 19 months, 2 days, 35 years, so many days and weeks. And unfortunately, as these stones age, it becomes harder and harder to be able to read them. So we do have some, today is Veterans Day, so we do have a number of veterans, early wars out in Olio Cemetery. Basil Meek was born on March 7th of 1763 in Maryland. He died in 1844 on the Meek farm after they had moved to this area. He was buried there on the Meek farm, but at a later date, the family cemetery was moved then to Olio. The biography of his grandson, Basil Duval Meek, states that Basil fought in the Home Guards during the American Revolutionary War. And so his stone, this is just kind of a portion of it here. And I did take a picture in about 1914. The Peoria DAR organization placed a marker, and they had a service and a ceremony out to honor as he was an American Revolutionary War veteran. So there's that marker that's still out there from 1914. Another early veteran was Elijah Dickinson. He was born in 1795 in Virginia. He served in a volunteer cavalry company during the War of 1812. He then later moved to Kentucky and then to Walnut Grove in 1835. He was an elder of the Walnut Grove Church, and then he also was president of what became the Eureka College Board from 1852 until his death in 1862. So again, another early veteran in the cemetery. 1855 is when the college and the town officially are formally organized and created. The Walnut Grove Academy, as I mentioned, it was kind of this two-story brick building that was on the side of the Rinker home. The church and other supporters actively promoted the academy statewide during this 1850s period after Ben Major's death, 1852. By 1854, they built a 50-student boarding hall and on what became later the college property. 4 teachers were employed, and then it was officially incorporated as Eureka College on February 6th of 1855. So that was kind of really taking formal shape now. This was going to be an academy or a college. The town of Eureka was about the same time. John Darst moved to Walnut Grove in 1851 from Ohio. He bought land north of the Major family, but when the railroad was built from Peoria to Kruger in 1855, Darst could see, okay, they're going to be coming through my land. So he sold the right of way through his land with the provision that a station be constructed here in what later became Eureka. So he got the right of way, and then he made plans to create Eureka. Not that long before this, they had already chosen Eureka for the name of the post office, because there was with the college there. They wanted a post office. Well, the name Walnut Grove was already used somewhere else in Illinois. So they had to come up with a new name. So Eureka was chosen for that post office. So Asa Fisher, who was a postmaster as well as teacher, surveyed the land, and the plat for Eureka was recorded on December 29th of 1855, and a public auction of lots was held then on January 1st of 1856. So the town of Eureka and the college then kind of grew up now closer to where the railroad was going through. So the church was still then kind of in the woods south of that, but they were starting to really grow. They had more and more people moving into the area, especially now that we had a town and the college. So they decided that a new church building was needed. However, this was about 1862 by this point, and the Warriors were a lot of financial hardship for a lot of families. So it took some time before they were finally able to raise more money to build a new church building. The church elders thought it would be best then if they did, succeed in building a new building, that they wanted to transfer the graveyard over to the town of Eureka for management. So the church, the Eureka Christian Church Disciple of Christ minute books are still available in existence with the church. And so that does give us some clues as to what was going on in terms of the cemetery at that point. So this is a picture of the minutes taken on June 21st of 1862. And it documents that A.S. Fisher was appointed to survey and plat the graveyard at that point. So to me, that says, okay, prior to this, there was no survey or plat of the graveyard. It was just kind of, you go out and you bury your dead. There wasn't any structure to it at all. In 1863, the church continued to plan about, and we're thinking about building a church on December 29th of 1862. Fisher was appointed, now that he had the survey completed, he was appointed to make inquiries concerning the names of owners of lots in the graveyard. So enough time had passed, they weren't even sure, who all was buried where and etc. And then on May 30th of 1863, E.W. Dickinson, C.E. DeWeese, and J.M. Allen were appointed to correspond with the heirs of Ben Major in relation to the title of the present church lot. So I'm sure a lot of things were done kind of by handshake. And so titles were maybe not always clear, clear land titles in terms of, how this all kind of took place and stuff. So they wanted to kind of, make sure that we have title of the present church lot and how, we gotta get our hands around how this actually is to be transferred then to the city at a later date. It wasn't until December 25th of 1864 that church services began in the new completed basement of the new brick building at 302 South Main, which is where the present day church is. This was their first church at that location. There's a photograph of it there. They finished the basement part first, so that's where they initially started holding their church services while they finished the upper portions. On March 18th, 1865, in the church minutes books, it was recorded that Brethren John Darst and M. Piper were appointed a committee to take such legal steps as may be necessary to vest the title of the graveyard in the president and trustees of the town of Eureka. So 1865 is when we see that officially get transferred over to Eureka for management. I kind of glossed over the Civil War, so backtracking just a little bit during the Civil War period. There were several companies of volunteers made up of primarily of Eureka men. The 17th Infantry, Company G, the 86th Infantry, Company A, the 108th Infantry, and the 139th Regiment of Company C. The exact number of Civil War casualties buried in the cemetery are known. Many of the men were buried on the battlefields, but their family erected a stone for them later here. So it's kind of really hard to determine exactly how many Civil War burials are actually out there. Here's two that I just really appreciate the symbolism on these two stones. Both of these were members of 17th Infantry Company G that lost their lives on the Shiloh battlefield. John Lightcap on the left, it's a very interesting stone. I've never seen one quite like this. So again, it's a broken column showing that his life was cut too short, too early, with a woman weeping over it and then an angel standing behind her, which to me is just beautiful symbolism there. The second one, James Skelton, has an hourglass with wings on it, finger pointing towards the hourglass, and then also a scroll. And at the very top is, can't hardly read it, but it says "Rest in Peace." And Jan told me that there's a little rectangular cutout there, and she believes at one time that would have held a tintype of the soldier, a photograph of that soldier. But at that time they were made of tin, and so very not weather resistant at all on that one. The hourglass symbolizes the passage of time in gravestone symbolism. So those are just two of the Civil War period stones. Like I said, they both died the same day on the Shiloh battlefield. So it's very likely their remains are still at that battlefield rather than being here. So their family may have just buried them here later or created a stone here for them later. Another Civil War casualty was William Ross Lowry. And earlier this year, Jan had asked me to do some research on this because it's a really unique monument. It's actually the only metal kind of monument that we have out there, or standing, kind of a taller standing monument that's made of metal. But she's like, we don't really know anything about him. So I started doing some digging. I discovered he was born in November of 1841 in the Schuyler County area. His father was a farmer who hired Lincoln to represent him in court. And William Ross and his brother would go with his father to some of the Lincoln Douglas debates in that part of the state. Ross enlisted in 1861 as part of the 2nd Illinois Cavalry, Company H. He served in the Army of the Mississippi, which was primarily based Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi during these early years. However, from his war records, he suffered from tuberculosis, which was another name for consumption at that point, or consumption's another word for tuberculosis. So his war records show that he was in hospital much of 1862. In December of 1862, they granted him a disability charge, unfortunately due to his tuberculosis, and that he had not been able to participate. However, his war records then also showed that he was a POW. And I was like, okay, how's that work? Well, just 2 days later, after they had officially signed off on his disability discharge, there was a surprise Confederate attack at Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is where he was at that point. And he was one of like 1,500 soldiers that were captured during this surprise attack. Now, the Confederates luckily immediately paroled all of them. They didn't, transfer them to a prison camp or anything. But that's how he also got a POW status there. What I think likely is after he was discharged in April 1862, he came to Eureka to help a widowed aunt. There was a Lowry family in Eureka in the 1860 US Census. She was a widow and she had several sons. A number of those sons also volunteered for the war effort. And so and I can only hazard a guess, but that she was in need of extra help. So he came here, lived here with her on the farm, kind of helped take care of things while her sons were fighting. And, some of her sons were discharged as well. So we don't really exactly know his full story here, but he did pass on April 26th of 1865. And the monument is completely hollow metal. It's made out of what they call white zinc. And it's just, pristine condition. It doesn't deteriorate, it doesn't rust or anything. And it was kind of popular later on, 1880s, 1890s. And what we discovered, it was his brother Thomas that actually purchased this monument. And it was really interesting, and how I found out so much about the family was that his brother Thomas didn't serve in the war, but he became a lawyer and he moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1867. He got into real estate, and then he was the president of a streetcar company in Minneapolis. He married into a prominent family. In present day Minneapolis, there is still a statue of his brother Thomas, as well as a neighborhood named after him. And the family has, the Lowry family then has a huge Greek column mausoleum building at the cemetery in Minneapolis. And his, William Ross's father and sister are marked in that monument, as well as his mother, who died, I want to say 1861 or something. But for some reason, he didn't have his brother exhumed and buried up there. He doesn't even mention his brother, as far as I know, up in that monument, but he did purchase the stone for him here in the Olio Cemetery. So there was actually a biography written by Thomas's grandson that I was able to get from a library in Minnesota and send it to me so I could read, and there was just like one mention of him having a brother. So I don't know, you wish you knew. You wish you could find out all those details of exactly how this all happened. But Jan does now have a better idea of who this, very unique memorial out in the cemetery, who that belongs to and who that commemorates, so. Other monuments out there, the 1868, after the Civil War, was when the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors Monument was erected. It was installed by the local GAR post in 1868 to honor the 29 men of the 86th Illinois Infantry Company A that were killed in action. So the four sides of it show some of the battles they participated in, a listing of all those that were killed in action. And in 2012, it was restored by the Eureka Rotary Club and Ross Stoneworks. And it's wonderful that they did that, because that white marble is so deteriorated that was, you couldn't read the names. So, but now it just looks absolutely beautiful in terms of being able to read. And so, of course, that is where the Memorial Day services are held every year now. Other Civil War veterans, of which there are many, again, we don't really have an exact number. Robert Chittick, he was on that previous Civil War soldier stone, his name was listed on there, he also has a separate stone. He died in 1865, he's in Section AB. Chastine Major, who was the son of Ben Major and Lucy Major, he died in June 8th of 1865, he was also part of the 86th Infantry. So he died shortly after the war, probably from injuries or illnesses. Illnesses by far, I think, took a lot of soldiers' lives. Ira Clark, here's some, people that died later that survived the war. So they have more of the typical government issued veteran stone was showing the shield, and it's kind of very plain. Ira Clark, he died in 1902. He was part of the Indiana Light Artillery. And then George Moses died in 1905. He was part of the 31st Indiana Infantry. And then about 1913, the local GAR post placed about 50 markers in the cemetery. And so you can still see those markers out there where there's known Civil War soldier stones. Additional 1860s gravestones, and for me this is kind of the height of the symbolism, and there's just so many just beautiful stones out there. Annie Ewing, she died in August 6th of 1860 in this house. She was the daughter of Albert Gallatin Ewing, who built this house in 1858. So she would have been living here when she passed. She died just 20 years old. And so her stone has a just simple dove on it, which again, peace, Holy Spirit symbol. Thomas T. Martin, he died on April 30th of 1863, only age 46. Again, you see that you can see a weeping willow, kind of a memorial stone and a weeping woman, and a really beautiful carved decoration all along the outside edge as well. That's a really beautiful stone. Octavia Radford died in 1864. Again, a weeping willow sign, a little bit different kind of linear design on the outside edges. J.R. Burton, he died in 1865, age 49. His stone, there are a lot of stones of kind of small columns, kind of what I kind of think of as plinths. I don't know if that's the right term or not, but just these small columns, and it has a mourning drapery on it, which is kind of like a mourning cloth draped on the top of it. He was also a member of the Masonic Lodge. There was a Masonic Lodge organized here in 1859. So you can tell by the book and the Mason symbol that he was a member of the lodge. And that's in section, most of these are in section AC, which was the second section to be used for burials. So 1865 was when the city took over management of the cemetery. They sold lots and they issued certificates to the lot owners. This certificate I found in the Eureka Christian Church archives. I'm not sure why it's there, but it was in there, so I thought, well, this is cool. So they sold a lot to J.R. Smith for $5. At that time, it was lot 169 in the cemetery. During this period, the city owners, city management of it, but if they sold a lot to you, you were expected to take care of that lot. So you were expected to go out there and mow or weed or, maintain it. Some lots were occupied, but were never paid for. And as I said before, even though they apparently made nice certificates, they didn't really keep good records. Or if they did keep records, they were lost. So there, again, are no known records currently for the period of the city's ownership from 1865 all the way to 1906. So almost 40 years of, we don't know what was all going on at that time in terms of what was out there. So, and then this one, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but when the township took it over, they really worked hard to try to track down the owners of lots and figure out everything. So this little notation at the bottom is the east half of the above lot has been deeded to the township by his widow. So he was never buried out there. There's no stone or anything for that family, so. 1870s and 1880s, again, during this period where the city owned it, you had lots more variety of stones. Charles Yeager died in 1870, just 3 to 4 years old. So again, we see that little lamb symbol for it being a child. Richard Jones has this really beautifully carved anchor and kind of an oval with his name on it. The anchor was a sign of hope or a symbol for hope during that period. Thomas Bullock stone is out there. He was he's known as being the founder of the county. He had a farm out towards the southeastern portion of the city, kind of southeast of Eureka, the Bullock farm. He came from Woodford County, Kentucky in 1835, and so he named it Woodford County, Illinois, after his home in Woodford County, Kentucky. And he lived near the town of Versailles, which was the first county seat, kind of back over there in that section. So he didn't pass until 1888, and so he's buried in section AC. This next little stone I included just because it's very heartbreaking again. So the Robeson family lost 4 children between 1880 and 1886. And so they purchased a monument that's just one monument, but it's like 4 of them joined together for their 4 children. So another very sad tale. There are some burials related to tragedies in the region. In 1887, there was a train heading from Peoria to New York that hit a burning culvert near Chatsworth about midnight on August 10th to 11th, 1887. 85 passengers died out of 500. The photo on the top there is from that train wreck. Among them, unfortunately, was Mahala Clay and her 3 children from the ages of 2 to 13. They were on their way to Niagara Falls. So their stones are here. This one, I believe, says mother, and then the name of the 3 children, and then they have one kind of center stone there. And then the wreck also claimed the life of Jesse Meek, age 21. And his stone actually mentions the tragedy. It says, Jesse G. Meek killed in Chatsworth train wreck on there. So, and he was just 21, so. 1890s is when the style of gravestones really changes. We start getting into these massive blocks of granite out there. Granite and marble, and it's just very, big, substantial. No one's gonna knock these suckers over. They are really tough. John Darst, of course, was the founder of Eureka. He's buried in section AB. He was 78 when he died in 1895. So it became a little more common during this period to have one stone with a family name on it, and then you would have smaller stones for each individual. So, so here would be John Darst, I believe I think that's his wife, but I'm not positive. So smaller stones of the family next to that or kind of surrounding the larger stone. Dr. C.T. and Jane G. Lichtenberg, I included this just because these are just so different. So it makes you think that they're buried within that, but Jan thinks they are buried underground, but for whatever reason, they chose stones that look like coffins. So it's just unique. There's the only stones I know of out there that look like that. They died in 1881 and 1893, so these stones probably date to that 1893 period. They are in section AB, really close to where the Civil War Soldiers Monument is. The Reverend Edward Hall and Jane C. Hall, again, you've got these massive blocks of granite. Sometimes they're rough cut to look like they're just actual stones rather than that they've been carved. So they'll be rough cut around the edges and stuff. And you also see just much more finer carvings and of their names and everything. And then the last one, Meta Barton and her infant daughter Meta. They both died in 1893. Again, so a lot more polished granite, columns were also very common during this period. So kind of transition from those gravestone symbols and everything that we saw earlier to this more of polished granite style. So as I kind of mentioned, there was poor administration and maintenance going on. The cemetery was just not in good shape. So in 1906, or 1905 actually, there was a special committee was established to address the problem that the cemetery was. The Olio Township Cemetery Association was organized in 1905. The first township trustees were C.J. Gibson, Joe Major, and E.W. Dickinson. Dickinson also served as the superintendent during that period. So when they took ownership in 1906, they immediately purchased some additional land so that they could expand the cemetery. So they bought 7.24 acres to the south of what their original plots were from Fred Smith for $3,200. And from what I read, the deal with Mr. Smith was, he's like, well, okay, I know you guys want this for the cemetery, but if you can find me another place to live with some land and a barn and stuff, I'll sell this to you. So they did. So they found him another place to live and got him settled so that they could have this piece for the cemetery. And then on April 7, 1906, the city council officially deeded the cemetery to the township. And they did have some quick claim deeds issued by the Major family just to kind of clear up any loose title things that were never resolved. And they officially legally titled it the Olio Cemetery. So that was the next section to be built, was this portion to the south bordering on Moody Street. They really got to work and tried to improve this and try to get a handle on all the lots. They first installed an iron fence around the cemetery. Materials were purchased from the Stewart Ironworks of Cincinnati, Ohio, and R. Piper did the installation. In 1908, the lot prices ranged from $45 to $100. With the sale of each new lot, they said, okay, we're going to take out 25%. We're going to put that into a trust fund for maintenance, for ongoing maintenance of the cemetery as a whole. So even today, I believe it's still like 25%, Jan said, that they take that goes into that maintenance fund. Attempts were made to contact owners of lots in the old cemetery to have them transfer their title, as I showed you on that certificate a few slides ago, or pay $25 for maintenance. So either give us the land or give us some money so we can take care of this. And boy, they were really tried very hard. They mailed information to everybody that they knew had lots in there. They wrote newspaper articles and ads, and some of them got so that they were like, okay, this quote here, we take pride in our churches, our paved streets, and cement walks with the parking along the same, while some of you allow your lots in the cemetery to grow up in weeds and briars because you do not furnish the trustees the means to take care of them. And they even kind of go on in that article to say, now, and if you don't contact us, if we don't hear from you, we may be forced to exhume your person.
Oh, wow.
Or, we might have to do the, very severe thing. We're going to have to exhume your person and, take them out, but you've got to get this done. So they had a lot of work cut out for them. They did it, and they also encountered occupied lots which had not been paid for. So they buried their family member there, but they never paid for the lot. It was quite the mess. It really, really was quite the mess. So they had their work cut out for them in taking over, and they, obviously did a lot of due diligence, trying as hard as they could to figure out where everyone was and where there were people buried. In 1908, they planted about 100 trees, which we still enjoy today. In 1915, there were plans to erect a building for funeral purposes. And Jan had said the small little brick building that's out there, she didn't know when it dated to. So I was like, I'm going to figure this out when this thing dates to. the closest I could come was that there was a plan to erect a small building for funeral purposes with a basement, and that building out there does have a basement under it. But whether they changed their plans or not, because that doesn't seem very big to hold funerals in, so I'm not sure exactly what happened. Unfortunately, right about that time, 1916, they stopped reporting in the newspaper what was going on, so I was like, I couldn't find any further details on what was going on at that point. But so the building that's out there, the little red brick building, we think probably dates then to about 1915, 1916. I can't imagine it having funerals in there, that's just way too small. 1910s and 1900s, the stones become even more polished. They're still pretty massive and blocky though. So one family I wanted to mention in particular, the Sarah and Robert Moody family. I had not heard this story, and it's an absolutely fascinating story. They, in fact, I'm going to, in February, do another program just on the Moody family because it was just such a fascinating story. Excuse me. Robert Moody was born in Tennessee. He was born free, his mother was free, but his father was a slave. So because his mother was free, he was then a free citizen when he was born in, let's see, 1828. So his father was a slave, but his mother was free. Mother wanted him to attend school, so he tried attending school down there, but he was forced out because Tennessee was not a very welcoming place for freed African Americans at that time. So him and his mom lived down there, but about 1842, he had to go to court to prove his free status. And so at that point, when they could prove that, yes, I'm a free individual, he was able to choose his own surname. So he chose the name Moody. So this was the name of his own choosing. At age 21, he bought some land and he hired his father, who was still working as a slave. He hired his father out to help him build the house and everything. And then I forget what time was that. He went to Canada for some education at that point. He went back to Tennessee in 1858 and he bought his father at a slave auction. So his father was up on a slave auction and he bought his own father so that he could free him. So he was for $250. So he was able to buy his father and he got his father to Canada. So he got his father settled in Canada. But Robert stayed in Tennessee because meanwhile he had fallen in love with this woman, Sarah, who was a slave for another plantation family, I believe, at that time. And he wanted to buy her, but this owner wouldn't sell her. So they went ahead and, I don't know how this works, but they went ahead and they got married, even though she was still a slave. So they married. And then the Civil War broke out. He was forced into the Confederacy. And he became a servant for some of the officers and stuff. So during the Civil War, they were married, but he had to serve as part of the Confederacy at the time. And then it's quite the story, but they were able to make connections with some Union officers and stuff, and they were able to escape with their child. So they escaped from the Confederacy in the South with their child, all three of them together. They were able to get back up to Canada, found his father, and he was doing really well. His whole story is just like, wow, I did not know all of this. So they did end up moving to Eureka in about 1883. They had 7 children. Robert died in 1916, and his obituary, which took up 3 columns of the front page of the local paper. It was 3 columns of his story in the local paper on the front page when he passed in 1916. So that's how we know more about his life. And his wife later died in 1926. So they have a stone out in AD. And Jan told me that she is still burying members of the Moody family. They are all, spread. They're no longer here, but some of them are coming back and to be buried here in the cemetery. where their, parents, grandparents were buried, so. So it's a fascinating story. Like I said, I'm gonna plan on doing, February is Black History Month, so I'm planning on doing a presentation just on this family, just because it's such an amazing story. So of course, Moody Street is named after him. And he lived there, and he had a gardening kind of business, and he also manufactured concrete blocks. And there's a house on Moody Street and one on Olio Street made of concrete blocks. Those are from his company or his manufacturing company at that time, so. Just fascinating story. So additional stones during this period I just included. I don't really have much information on the families, but again, they're just really just interesting. That turn of the century, they're still pretty massive blocks, but a lot more polished engravings on them. World War I broke out 1914, 1918. Two stones that I want to point out are two stories. Benjamin Hacker is not buried in Olio Township Cemetery, nor does he have a monument. He is actually buried in France, but I did want to include his story just because the first American Legion post was named after him. And the American Legion, it has such close ties with Olio Township Cemetery in terms of all the services and the veteran memorials and everything, that I did want to include his story. Benjamin was born in 1898 to Carl and Lena Hacker. He volunteered 9 days after war was declared in April of 1917. He died about a month after his parents received his last letter. So his parents received his last letter, about a month later he passed. He did serve on the front lines, but unfortunately he ended up dying of meningitis about a month. Actually real close to armistice, he died of meningitis, and he is buried in France. He was the first American boy to die in service overseas, and in November of 1919, the American Legion post was established, and it was named in his honor. And their first building was this white frame, 1.5 story building, and this building was located between the Eureka Christian Church and the high school, kind of where the tennis courts used to be, and where they have expanded, that's where the American Legion building was. The photo of it there. The next person, Frank Harold Richardson. He was born in 1894 to Charles and Anna Hamilton. He graduated from Eureka High School in 1913. He then entered Eureka College and graduated from there in 1917. He was part of the draft. So he was drafted into the Army Aviation Corps at that time in August of 1918. And he was training to be a pilot, and unfortunately, there was an airplane accident in Texas just about a month before he was supposed to be deployed overseas, where and I didn't see a description of how the accident happened, but he fell, I don't know if they said 400 feet or something, or he fell from a great height. And so he was thought to be able to recover from his injuries, but then he passed. He was not able to make it, so he is buried in Section AC. Another World War I veteran, Tom Davidson, he died in 1967. So that, again, some of these government issued stones changed it to kind of by the 50s and 60s to just flat stones rather than the more square markers. Okay, he was a sergeant in the Army in World War I, the son of Wilden and Eliza Jane Davidson. About the same time as World War I was the Spanish flu epidemic, and it was really interesting to me, at the time when we just started going through the COVID-19, I did some research on this because I was curious what the Spanish flu looked like here in Eureka. And it was pretty brutal, short-lived. The month of October 1918 was the worst of it, but there were, I think, what did they say? There were at least 10 deaths in Eureka from it. The first death was on October 8th by Roy P. Brubaker. He was just 34 years old. And And then after that, there were several husband and wives that died. Wilfred H. and Viola D. Rossborough, they died within 5 days of each other, ages 28 and 24. So, you know, young, healthy individuals were succumbing to this. And they, I believe, if I can remember, they left a 2-week-old daughter when they passed. Lyford Bradle on the end there, he died October 20th. He was just 14 years old. And it's recorded that they're buried in Olio Cemetery, but there's no current gravestones for them that I could find. Howard and Geraldine Glasgow, another husband-wife pair that died the 12th and the 21st, again, 26 and 23. Kind of think of it hitting some of the older or very young, but in this case, it really hit the middle-aged or young adults at this point. Elsie Hebner, she died on October 24th. She was just 13. And what I read was that when she got sick, the Eureka Christian Church at that point was turned into a makeshift hospital. And she was there at the Christian church, and that's where she died, was at the church as part of that. And then Linda Rush died on October 24th, 1832. And these are just the ones that I know were buried in Olio Cemetery. There were others that died. There was a college student and the mother of a college student and things like that, but they were buried elsewhere then at a later point. And then the newspaper article was the first mention of the Spanish flu epidemic was October 10th. Unfortunately, the week before that, I think it was like October 3rd edition, never got digitized, so I can't see if people were already like, okay, it's coming, or what's going on. The October 10th was the first one where it mentions the influenza epidemic and it's causing much alarm, and the first initial people that passed on it were mentioned there. Going into the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the stones, some are getting, more simpler and smaller at this point, just, some very beautiful engravings on them. The one on the left, Gloria Hefner, I had to look this one up because I was just so fascinated by the tombstone reading Grandpa's Fluffy. So her grandfather had a nickname for her that she was his Fluffy, and she was just 7 years old. So again, they used the old symbolism of the lamb though for that stone. So it's just a really just, I don't know, just heart-wrenching to see that. Albert Rowan, I read a little, he was only 18 years old, but I really liked the stone because it was a little bit different to me. It has more of a cathedral pointed arch design to it. I did look him up just to find out more about him, and he was actually from Pekin, but maybe he had previously lived here, and he died unfortunately in an accident where he was riding a bus back to Pekin, and he had his arm kind of like resting out the window while he slept while riding on the bus, and it got crushed by a truck passing too close by. And so, then he was not able to recover from it. So that was very sad thing to read. Margaret and John Hyken, again, that's just, to me, a really just beautiful stone with a tree design kind of in the center. Samuel Elizabeth Skelton still had kind of a little bit older style with the kind of the rough cut stone around the edges. World War II, there are many World War II veterans buried out there. So I just chose 2 to talk about. Wilmer Eugene Dyer, he was the second son of Wilmer Dyer. He graduated from Eureka High School in 1934. He attended Eureka College. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in October of 1941. He earned his bombardier wings and was stationed in England. Unfortunately, he was reported missing in action on December 20th of 1942 when his plane went down over occupied territory. So he is just mentioned on the Dyer family stone. His remains were never recovered. So he was awarded a Purple Heart and an Air Medal after the war. Dallas Psychology, we're starting to get into people that we know. So Dallas was born in June of 1923. He enlisted in 1943. He was a medic and a paratrooper. He did take part in D-Day, where he parachuted behind enemy lines as part of the 101st Airborne. Unfortunately, though, what I read is they were trying to establish a hospital and stuff in that area. He was taken prisoner, and he was taken to Stalag 4, prisoner of war camp. So he spent a very, very brutal winter there until they were liberated in May of 1945. He was awarded the Purple Heart, the Presidential Citation Ribbon, as well, and glider wings as well for his service. And so, of course, modern veteran stones are kind of the more meadow, very flat on the ground stones, but very beautiful. Samuel Ellis Adams, this is another really, probably our most famous burial out in the cemetery. So Samuel was born in 1919 in Kentucky to Mars and Lucy Adams. They moved here to Eureka in 1927. He graduated from Eureka High School in 1940. He married Dorothy Sherman the next year in 1941. And then he enlisted on the 12th of February, 1942. He was trained to be an Army Air Force gunner on the B-24D Liberator planes. If you look at the Woodford County Journal, as well as Eureka Christian Church newsletters and stuff, he wrote a lot of letters during his early service years of where he was at, what he was doing. So they would publish his letters in the Woodford County Journal, along with a number of other soldiers. So if you have any ancestors that served as soldiers, that's something to look for in the your local newspaper, because they would write letters and publish them. He was overseas in March of 1943 as part of the 376 Bombardment Group. And on April 4th, he was part of a 9-man team on the airplane, the Lady Be Good. And they were based in Libya, and they were doing their inaugural kind of bombing run to Naples, Italy. And they unfortunately, it was their inaugural run. There were things that kind of happened, and on their return, they missed the air base in Libya. They flew over it. They weren't able to see it, find it. It was all just desert at that time. They kind of got lost. They parachuted out. One died on impact from when they landed. And then the remaining 8 members of the crew just started walking in the desert. They didn't know where they were in relation to their base, but they started walking. He had written a letter to the Eureka Christian Church prior to that bombing run. And this letter was published on the front page of the church newsletter on April 11th. And it was written, he was just the Middle East, it didn't say Libya or anything, it's just Middle East, Tuesday night. And he writes, "We moved into our camp a few days ago and had a chance to go to church. As I sat in the church, I thought of the last time I was home and in our church. And I thought, there is such a difference between ours and this one. We have church out in the open and sit on tin cans for chairs. I said to myself, if people could only see what was here, they would sure appreciate our church at home a lot more. I know it made me think. The boys over here think nothing of all of where it is. All they think of is what it is and what it means. I wish I could get a picture of it and send it home, but that is impossible. I'm writing by candlelight, so if it is hard to read this letter, you will know why. Well, I'm going to close for now and get some sleep. I have a rather large day tomorrow." So we don't know exactly when this letter was written, but this was in the church bulletin on April 11th. The very next day, his parents were notified that he was missing in action. So on April 12th is when his parents got the word that he was missing in action. So they had so at that point, well, let's skip ahead a little bit. It wasn't until 1958 that the wreckage was sighted from the air, that they saw a plane wreckage out there. 1859, they went back to investigate that plane wreckage. And it wasn't until 1960 that the bodies were found about 85 miles north of the plane where the plane crashed. So they had hiked 80 plus miles from wherever they parachuted out on their way to get north. It's complete desert. They had very little water, nothing. So according to a diary that was found with the bodies, on April 9th, they had stopped walking. They got to the point where they just couldn't walk any longer. It was April 9th, and on April 12th was the last entry of the diary. So the day after, this was published, he was already perished or perishing in the desert at the time that the church family read this letter. So really heart-wrenching story. He was returned, his body was returned to Eureka in March of 1960, and he was given a funeral service. So his stone is out there in section BD, which is closest to the road in Moody Street. 1946, after the war, the Cemetery Association purchased additional acreage to the east to have more room for expansion. The northern portion was purchased from C.M. Douglas and his sister Jessie Douglas. That section is what's currently terraced and not used. And they also purchased 2.5 acres from Iva Parks, and so that is the current sections CA, CB, and CC. So that is, the furthest that they have enlarged to this point. Additional stones in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Richard Rhodes died during the Vietnam War. He was in near an air base, and he driving an armored personnel carrier and came under heavy fire. So he died in the line of duty. He was awarded a Purple Heart and a Good Conduct Medal and a Bronze Star Medal for his service. Dr. Emery and Marta Ross. He is another, probably the next maybe famous person that's buried in the cemetery. He was a very internationally known missionary to Africa from the Disciples of Christ denomination. He was born in 1887 in Indiana, but he graduated from Eureka College in 1908. He became a minister in 1912, and then from 1912 through 1930s and probably beyond, he served as a missionary in Africa. He was an author. He had many presidential and vice presidential positions of boards and aid societies. He died in New York. His service was held in New York, but the family brought him back here to be buried, which to me was just amazing. Jan also said this is a family that's still having their descendants buried here in Eureka, even though they've not lived here for a very long time. He was also a friend of Albert Schweitzer, who was a medical missionary and a Nobel Peace Prize winner and stuff. So he's, again, just really well known for his work. Earl and Helen Woosley, I just included this as another example of just kind of, again, the flat metal stones. They had a child that died in 1937, and so she has an additional stone there that is just like a little heart cut out. Memorial Days, Avenue of Flags, which you can see out today, Veterans Day. They have all the flags up today as well. So in October of 1983, the Townships Association launched their Avenue of Flags project. It was initiated by John Copley. Monetary donations were accepted by friends, families, to purchase flags, poles, and nameplates for the veterans. So each one of those tall flags does have a nameplate on it with a loved one's name and what they served in, or what branch of the military and their service dates that they were in. In 1984, there were 57 flags. Today, according to Jan, my slide is out of date, there's over 200. Along with, they also have small flags at each veteran's grave site. So Memorial Day and Veterans Day are when they bring those out. 80s and 90s, oh, the stones just get so much more interesting. The designs now that they can come. So I just included a few. Stephen Bingley, of course, probably the next more famous personage we had. Of course, he was a Eureka College professor. He graduated from the college in 34. He was a research chemist, and he was on a team who won a Nobel Prize for helping discover vitamin K. And then the additional stones I just included because I thought they were interesting from this period. One is a complete triangle, or a diamond shape actually. The engravings on them are just so personalized. The Welker family one, I think, is the only one I know of out there that's colorized, which I think is really cool. Continued improvements. In 1978, the Eureka Junior Women's Club donated a pair of benches near the office. So those are still there. More benches have been now added in the newer sections. Beginning in 2011, the original 1906 fence was replaced by Horulan Fence Company in Goodfield. The west fence next to Main Street was the one that was replaced first, because that had the most damage from salts in the road and things like that. So they replaced that between November and January 2011, 2012. However, they did leave the original posts and gates at the west entrance. Those are the original 1906 ones. They did refurbish those. Those are just, beautiful pieces, so they kept those in place. But all the other fence then has been replaced. 2018 was when the remaining fences were able to be replaced due to memorials for Rosemary Harder. Modern stones, just to finish this up, again, it's just so fascinating the things that they can do now with the laser engraving. And there are even some that have little cutouts where they have things inside of like a little window, which are interesting. And then I included my dad's cousin, Anna Lou Harms, and her husband, the Reverend Alvin Harms. They have a stone with this really beautiful, just cut out of a simple cross. And so I can see that every time I drive by. It's really nice to see. To finish up, would be remiss if I didn't mention the Harder family. Olio Township Superintendent Rosemary Harder, she was superintendent for more than 53 years. She stepped into the role in 1963 when her father, Ellis Sharp, died. So he was the superintendent prior to her. She resigned in September of 2017. She passed in 2018. But it was her wish that when she passed that memorials be made to the fence fund. She really wanted to see that fence get completed. So over 5,000 was donated, and then in addition to Rosemary's own request, the remaining fences were then able to be replaced. Jan Holliger continued her mother's work since then. She became caretaker in 1972 and then superintendent in 2017 when Rosemary retired. So I tried to find a good picture of Rosemary online and I could not find one, but Rosemary was also an author. So this is actually the cover of a book that she wrote on commodity marketing. So I couldn't find another good picture of her from before then, but she was just so active in the agricultural community. But her long tenure at the cemetery between her and now Jan, they are the ones that know everything there is to know about the cemetery. So I'm very thankful for Jan's help with filling in the blanks and getting me started. So Jan had done initially, 2009 or so, she wrote a little piece called a walk through history, Olio Township Cemetery. So this is what Jan originally came up with. So this is what I used for a basis for the lecture. And then Karen Pike, the Woodford County Historical Society then does have an index of all the burials through 2009. So not up to date, but it is alphabetical by last name. So this is a really good resource if someone's looking for a particular person to figure out where they're buried. And now you kind of know, because it lists A, B, AC, then I kind of know these. Yeah. Now the numbers of the actual plots, those I tried using that and yeah.
Didn't work.
There's a numbering system out there for that, but I've never been able to completely, figure it out.